As a communication studies professor, when students come into my classrooms, whether it's public speaking, interpersonal communication, or organizational, I want them to come out of my classroom actually practicing how they can have more meaningful conversations, more meaningful interactions through understanding how communication works and the messages they put out and the messages they interpret from other people. And part of that involves them thinking about real world scenarios. Thing about that is it's really hard to go out and record actual interactions and to get a conflict, for example, like a roommate conflict or a family member dispute interaction across time, which is how these things regularly play out, right? So I want them to have some hands-on experience on doing something and thinking through and working through communication problems, right? So how do you do that? Well, again, you can send them out there to do those kind of things, and you can also get them to share stories about communication issues that they experience. But one thing I found really helpful is using Achieve's video case studies and video libraries, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today on how we use them in my classroom. So my goal today is a simple one. What I want to do here is introduce myself briefly, tell you a little bit about my experiences and why I'm here talking about this today. Second, I'll give you a little insight into the plethora of video activities and case studies that are available for communication-oriented courses. And then lastly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I've adapted it in some ways, in part because my students have given me new ways to think about it, and we've changed things up a bit based on the creativity and interactions we've had. So I'll just give you some tips on how to use them. Let's talk briefly about myself. Position-wise, I'm at Dakota State University. It's a really tiny university in Madison, South Dakota, rural kind of area. We focus on technology-oriented things like AI and cybersecurity. And my role in that is I teach them communication, right? So I get them in that one or two courses that they kind of come through. One thing to say about my other kind of roles, I'm our Center for Teaching and Learning director at DSU. And so I get a chance to do a lot of pedagogy kind of things and work with faculty on those kind of development elements. And then lastly, I usually don't mention this, but I'll mention my research because it kind of relates to what we're talking about today. I study hand gestures and body movement, specifically how people creatively use their hands to imagine things in collaborative spaces. So like, for instance, I've looked at dance making and creating kind of dance products. I've also looked at conflict mediators as they work through conflicts and use their hands to do that. So it's related to this idea of role playing and kind of trying things out. And so it is related to the case studies and things we're going to talk about. One thing I'll kind of say about the things that we're thinking about here, the video activities and case studies that Achieve offers, they come in a variety of forms. So we're not going to get to see all of them today. This is just kind of one example here where you have a video and then you have some text prompts and questions that students can engage with and answer either real time, if you're doing it in class, or outside of class, if you're doing it asynchronously. So they often get a video that has some kind of problem or scenario that's acted out. Sometimes they are real scenarios, like a real speech, actually. Other times, like this one here, which comes from Choices and Connections, is an acted out scenario where two people are trying to work through a kind of a group project dispute, right? And so they're working through an issue. There's a lot of different types of video activities and collections. And actually, if you ever look in one of the communication books, I saw there's like 100 plus videos in there that you can look at that come in a variety of forms. I like the ones though that give them these reenactment kind of scenarios. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but it gives students an opportunity to actually practice what they're doing, right? So they are learning communication concepts, theories, and ideas. And then we have some scenarios that they can kind of think through and work on. In this kind of lens here, I'll just say a couple things about this. One thing I've kind of found that's been useful in doing these role play scenarios and case studies together is that oftentimes you can assign it just as it is if you want, which it has predetermined questions and predetermined areas they kind of go down, or you can get kind of creative with it. And this is kind of where I've come to it in terms of engaging with these role play scenarios and case studies, is I've found that there are several things you can kind of take away that'll help you make these more fun and engaging. One is being intentional. So I often use these case studies or role plays at a particular time in a weekly rhythm. I always, on a Friday, for example, when I have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, I often set that aside just for role play activities and case studies. We do them together in class. We can break into small groups, but they know that's going to happen. And that's also strategic because if you think about the learning experience of a student, right? They're engaging in materials. They are learning new concepts and ideas. And at the end of the week, we're kind of pulling that all together. So I don't want to put this at the beginning of the week. I want this as something that kind of brings all these ideas together and we can have a really great discussion about it. Second, one thing that's kind of funny about these, sometimes you might be thinking to yourself, role play scenarios where they're acted out or reenactment can be kind of cheesy. I'll admit it, right? But I'm a big fan of reenactment shows like crime or paranormal reenactments, right? But one thing I do is I be intentional about talking to my students about the value of it, right? We can kind of joke about the fact that it's kind of a little bit removed from real life, but this gives us insight into actual communication situations that we otherwise won't have privy access to unless we've just experienced something like that. But I don't know about you all, but if you've ever had a family dispute or any kind of relational issue, it develops over time, right? And so it's hard to see that in one little glance or one little moment. The case studies and role plays try to really pull that all together in one little kind of area that's about maybe 3 minutes, usually about that range, 2 to 3 minutes in that kind of piece. Other things that I've found that they've been really useful for is doing some group work and group thinking together. So I'll often assign these kind of video activities as groups and allow them to work through them, communicate about the situations, and then lastly kind of share out some of the ideas as it relates to their own lived experiences, because we want to get them to that stage too, right? I want them to be able to take this problem solving skill when they're looking at a scenario like when they're working in groups and trying to work through a group project and they come up with a conflict. I want them to be able to solve that on their own or work together collaboratively, to do that. And so I need them to be actually practice what we're doing, right? So I'll get them into that space. Lastly, I've just found by using this as a little space to engage together, I found out that they share a little bit more about some of the experiences that they have in their own lives. So it's been really kind of fun. Now, here's where you can also get really creative, depending on how you feel about this. I had a theater colleague of mine who kind of was a little hesitant to use some of this, again, for the cheesiness, but then she creatively adapted this, and I loved this, so I'm going to kind of borrow this. She kind of had them engage with the role plays throughout the semester. Then she had them create their own role play scenario. And they acted it out. They scripted it. They acted it out. So I've actually done this a couple times, and I had one that was really fun. I had them put together, for example, the worst PowerPoint, right, with all the, terrible font, terrible images, right? You can't see everything. There's too much text, all that kind of stuff. And then I had them deliver that as kind of one of the little cases, and we kind of analyzed the complexities of that. I've also had them do some ones on nonverbal communication. So again, one thing I kind of want to give you is, as you're thinking about whether you might want to use something like this, whether you want to use the examples that show needs improvement speeches, or you want to use ones that have case studies where they work through actual communication problems, you can use them creatively beyond just assigning them, right? That is a possibility. You can assign them. They have pre-aligned prompts and ideas, but there's ways you can do this creatively that I've found personally more motivating, more engaging, and just to be fun overall for the classroom. As we're kind of thinking about this, one kind of thing I want to kind of emphasize, and I think this kind of goes for all of the talks you'll hear throughout this, is all the people here have really creatively adapted these tools and techniques, right? You're intentional about how you use them. You talk to your students about how they can be useful. And in my case, using these role play scenarios has helped me to actually make sure at the end of my course, they feel more confident as people who can solve problems on their own, right? Communication problems. Now, we're not going to be able to cover everything, right? But we're giving them that practice low stakes space where they can try things out, see how communication trajectories might go, and understand how people have different perspectives and different viewpoints. Because one big key takeaway I've found too is you're helping students practice empathy and understanding different perspectives when they're looking at situations that are similar to theirs or even different from theirs. So I hope you go out and try some really fun things with these video activities. I'm happy to talk about more of these things later. So thank you for your time.